Shawn DuBravac. I'm the chief economist for the Consumer Technology Association. It's great to be here with you. And just for a few minutes, I'm going to build off of what Bruce spoke about. We'll then follow up with a joint Q&A between the two of us. I should note that this presentation, as well as all of the presentations, will be available on the registration page. So you'll be able to go there presumably later today and have access to all of those. So let me begin with a quote from Woody Allen. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. I think this is how a lot of us feel when it comes to jobs and automation. And so I think it's worth diving into some of the research and looking at some of the broader statistics around how things are shaping up. I have a rule not to sound like an economist before 9:30 or after 11, so unfortunately, since we're in that window, you're going to get the economist in me. This is a look at corporate compensation as a percent of what we call corporate GDP. So this is essentially how much of the value add that corporations in America create is going to the employees. And you can see for a very long time, going back to just after World War II, it hovered right around 63%. And that was true until about 2005, 2006, when it started to decline. And it's been much slower. Now, we've seen it recover a little bit. Bruce mentioned an unemployment rate of 4.5%. As that labor market tightens, presumably employers capture a greater percent of the value add of corporations. But we also see more of that value add being dedicated towards capital consumption. And so that mix of labor and capital shifting in our economy, which is a story around, obviously, machines becoming more integral into what we do in our lives. I'll hit on some of the academic research. David Otter of MIT did some fabulous work looking at how jobs have shifted and ultimately the polarization of our workforce. If you look at the spectrum of jobs by their class of skills, you can see employment gains over several periods in that task-intensive, low-income, kind of low-wage series of jobs. And then over time, what we had seen, especially early on, was that the more that was required of jobs, we saw improvements in employment gains over time. That over time, we've seen that hollowing out. So this is essentially that job polarization story that we see. You see growth at the low end, you see growth at the high end, and you see that shift starting to move up over time. So in the 1980s, jobs losing worker share fell in the 45th percentile. Today, it's closer to the 75th percentile. So it's starting to erode in what we have historically considered higher skilled, higher waged jobs. And yet, right now, very few jobs could be fully automated with the current stock of technology that we have in place. This from McKinsey, only about 5% of jobs could be automated using today's technology, while about 60% of jobs could have some 30% of their tasks automated. And so I think that's really where we'll start to see the influx of automation and of digitization, if you will, is that it will impact certain pieces of our job, certain pieces of our skill. So moving forward, the jobs of the future really will be a collaborative effort between humans and machines. We've seen job growth primarily taking place in what we consider non-routine work. So this is a chart of job growth over the last 20 years indexed to May of 2007. So you can see the last 10 years and the 10 years prior to that. And it hasn't been just knowledge workers that have seen growth gains in employment. It's also been in what we would consider manual, non-routine work. So this would be things like dentists, hygienists, and others that are doing relatively manual work, but it's non-routine. So they have an adaptive environment. And you can think about how that's played out in the economy. Consider something like replacing your windshield. For new cars and a new vehicle, most of the windshields are put in using robotics. If you've seen anything that's taking place in the manufacturing facilities of large auto manufacturers. Most of the times they're using robotics, but if you crack your windshield and you have it replaced, you don't take it to where the robots are, right? It's an adaptive environment. Each situation is unique, and so we're still primarily using labor to do that. And so I think that is also indicative of where job growth will take place, is in these non-routine areas where we require adaptive human thought and adapting to what's happening in that environment. I think another key theme here is that we have this looming economic growth gap. Over the last 50 years, the economies of the G19 plus Nigeria have grown about 3.5% on average per year. Half of that has come essentially from labor growth, and the other half has come from productivity gains. If you look at projections over the next 50 years, labor growth is expected to contribute only about 1/10 of a percent point in that gains. And so if we have productivity gains of 1.8%, you're looking at economic growth for the G19 plus Nigeria of right around 1.9%, or almost half of what it has been over the last 50 years. So moving forward, if we want to maintain economic growth consistent with the last 50 years, not only are we going to need all of the people working, but we're also going to need all of the machines working together. We're going to have to make up a significant amount, and all of that will show up in productivity gains driven by the right use of capital. I think there's an important story in what happened in 1996. So Garry Kasparov, a world chess champion many of you are probably familiar with, loses to Big Blue in 1997. After beating it in 1996, he loses it in 1997. So this was a phenomenal storyline at the time. It was covered on all of the major newspapers, all of the major weeklies, and in it, I think we see the role that computers have. And you can really think about the history and the legacy of intelligent machines dating back to this battle, machine versus human thought in a game of chess. Obviously, since then, we've seen a lot of iterations into other games and more complex situations. In 1998, a year after losing to Big Blue, Garry Kasparov introduces what he calls advanced chess. So he allows chess masters to play with the aid of a computer. And then in 2005, chessplay.com introduces a tournament with a very high stakes called freestyle chess. So this essentially allows for anything to take place. You have the basic rules of chess, but you can use computers. And so because of the large pool in play, a number of grandmasters from around the world got involved. But the outcome was interesting. You had two amateur chess players playing together using 3 computers at the same time, beat out all of the grandmasters, all of the computers that joined into that tournament. And so the quote, I think, from Kasparov is telling of where the future goes in humans working together with machines. Weak human plus machine plus better process was superior to a strong computer alone, and more remarkably, superior to a strong human plus machine plus inferior process. So it isn't just capital being deployed, and it isn't just humans working, but it's tying those together in the right mix, in the right context, in the right way. And so as we look at how we train workers in the future, it's about how do we train them to work collaboratively with the machines that are going to be integral to the roles that we're going to have. And we've seen, Garry mentioned, and others today have mentioned it, jobs change over time. In 1950, there was almost 100,000 elevator operators in the United States. There's almost none today. It's a job that's shifted because the technology has shifted. So in order to keep up with the times, it's important that we train individuals to think and to add value to these environments that are increasingly being digitized. And these are just a couple of the examples of where I think things start to go. Kiva Systems, obviously, is a great example, purchased by Amazon. And you can see how the warehouse moves around the person packaging the Amazon packages. So it's actually capital being deployed in that warehouse setting to move the shelves to the individual picker, rather than running around with a pick list throughout the warehouse to pick up the items. Improving the productivity of that individual worker with the deployment of capital. Da Vinci, which just recently announced stellar quarters with increased sales, is a machine that is involved in surgeries together with a surgeon. So it's a surgeon working together with capital. And you're seeing other robots as well, many of which we saw at CS. So I'll end there with those examples. I'll invite Bruce back on stage, and we'll have a minute or two for any questions from the audience. We've got a question right here, it looks like.
Hi, Richard Feller with Hedgehog Technology Services. Shawn, you always do a great job of making that math mind start to go, but I guess my question really comes down to this. How do you as an economist, since we're still in the economy time frame, and the government factor in the jobs from the sharing economy, like Uber and Airbnb and all that? How are those jobs factored in? Are those kind of the new job that, you know, as you were talking with Kasparov, talking about how there's a new economy? Has it already started with that? And are those being factored into some of our job numbers, et cetera?
So those do show up in the official job numbers when we look at unemployment and we consider whether people are in or out of the workforce. And I think those are telling, because what we're doing with the sharing economy is we're actually taking underutilized capital and deploying it in a more productive way. So you're taking a vehicle that was being underutilized, a private vehicle, and you're deploying it in a more effective way, a more productive way. You're taking an unused room or an unused house, and you're deploying it in a more productive way. So to me, a big part of the story about the sharing economy is taking capital that was being underutilized and deploying it in a more effective, more efficient way. And I think that's one of the things that's missed when we have that policy discussion. We would never say, oh, you've got a bulldozer in your backyard, you're not allowed to rent it out to somebody, you're not allowed to lease it to somebody. But we do that in certain settings when it comes to your car or your house. And really what we want to do is take capital and deploy it in the most efficient way. Milton Friedman told a famous story where he was in India, I believe, and he was taken to a work site, and they were digging with shovels, and he was told by the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Economy that it was a quote, jobs program, to which he responded, why don't you give them all spoons then? And so we would never consider doing that, and so I think we'll see more examples of sharing economy type jobs evolve in the future as we take capital we didn't realize we had access to and deploy it in more efficient ways. And obviously the smartphone facilitated the development of these two-sided markets, where you could take somebody who had the capital and allow them to deploy it into a robust marketplace. Any other questions? I think we've got one in the middle.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Gorman. I'm from the Office of Senator Mark Warner. I was curious about your data on the decline of corporate compensation relative to corporate value add, and wondering if you could speak a little bit more about to what you attribute that decline.
So I think there's probably a couple of things that could be driving that. One is it just a cyclical phenomenon that going into the recession and then ultimately coming out of the Great Recession into what was a relatively mediocre recovery, companies were able to add value. So we saw growth in profits and growth in other kind of value add metrics. But they didn't necessarily pass that on to their employees for a number of reasons. One, because the labor market, there was a lot of slack in the labor market, so there wasn't these upward pressures that we typically see in a tight labor market where employees can go out and demand higher wages, or they'll move to different jobs in order to garner higher wages. And so because we had this tremendous slack in the economy and the labor market, in particular, companies retained that value add or deployed it into other ways, which is capital. So the offsetting metric there over the long term has been essentially depreciation, capital consumption. Companies shifting a little bit of that equation between how much of a value add goes to labor and how much of it goes to capital. So I think that's part of the story. Though if you look at some of the other metrics, and it could be that we have a massive mismeasurement problem, but we haven't seen strong productivity growth since the recession and through the recovery. We also haven't seen tremendous amount of growth in capital expenditures. So if we were really in a period where we were seeing kind of mass automation, you would see capital expenditures at much higher rates, and you would also in turn then see you would see productivity rates that were much higher. So I think one of the great concerns out there is that technology has changed in such a way that the jobs won't be able to keep up, that the human race can't keep up with the rate of change. That hasn't been true for hundreds of years. The concern is that now it is suddenly true. Not all of the statistics, and certainly the ones I just mentioned, growth in capital expenditures and growth in productivity, support that premise. It looks like we're making these changes as needed.
Could I ask a question?
Please.
Gary Shapiro. First, could either one of you talk about the changes in demographics given our aging population and the impact or not if we have reduced immigration on the economy and jobs? And second, could you talk about the changes that we know are certain that are coming, such as a self-driving car and AR, VR, artificial intelligence, things like that?
Yeah, Bruce, do you want to hit on something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a number of those technology waves are surging. AR, VR, I talked about Internet of Things, and also sort of the disintermediation of how work is actually conducted. The project-based nature of work, I think, is going to become more and more prominent. So that agile workforce that we talked about, and part of that's the sharing economy, that's underway, and that's just going to continue to expand. So I think many of these trends are well in motion. And personally, I think that the self-driving car thing is just really getting started. Every day I open the newspaper and I see another set of companies committing resources and goals towards reaching that. And it's global too. It's not only, it's with trucks, it's with automobiles, so it's gaining a lot of traction. I think a couple other things that we see coming are, I didn't talk about this, but there's also a tremendous investment in HR technology. Last year there was $2 billion in venture money pumped into startups. There were over 400 deals done in this country. And I think some of that technology will start to impact how talent is found, how it's retained, and how it's trained. So I would watch that space as another example of how things are going to shift and become more interesting.
Yeah, and just to add a couple points to points Bruce made, the storyline I tell around the glooming economic slowdown globally across the G19 plus Nigeria is a story around demographic shifts. So demographics, when you had a robust growth in, and this is less a story about immigration and more a story of aging, when you had a robust labor market and younger cohorts of individuals, about half of our growth over the last 50 years was driven by labor growth. Over the next 50 years, at least for the G19 plus Nigeria, so this includes some of the largest countries, right? It's the United States, but it's also Indonesia and India and others. Labor growth is only expected to be 0.1% added to that growth story. So that as the workforce ages, more of that growth will have to come from productivity-enhancing technologies and ultimately from capital. And so as I look at jobs moving forward, the jobs we're going to want to focus on are jobs that complement this digitization well. So it's jobs that work well in an environment that requires dynamic interaction with computers or other systems. This doesn't mean everyone should be a programmer. It simply means that your jobs will increasingly be infused with elements of technology. So things, tasks, skills that can be easily codified are easily then learned and done by computers. It's the non-routine type of our jobs that are difficult to codify and then therefore difficult to drive by computers. I think all of us in the room would probably say we do more multitasking today than cohorts prior to us. That to me is a sign of dynamic, changing and labor environments where you have to do non-routine work and your work is always shifting across different spaces. And so we've done that naturally to adapt to this environment where technology is taking over some of the more rudimentary, routine type of activities. Maybe one last question if we have time. Oh, okay, sorry.
Hi, Rick Lane. As a son who's graduating college in a couple of weeks, I'm very interested in the future of work. So anyone has a job? No, just kidding. But one of the concerns that when I look at the charts is that a lot of the jobs, obviously, you're talking about, VR jobs in VR, AR, software engineers, and so forth. But there's a large percentage of kids who are graduating in the next few weeks and the next few years who are not going to have that skill set, a STEM skill set. So from a Monster perspective, and when you're looking at your data, what do you see kind of a trend line for those? Because what I'd be concerned about is what we start developing what I call an unemployable class. And then the last thing, I think point that you made, I agree. I think we should stop talking about artificial intelligence and talk about intelligence augmentation, because that's really how we have to look at this, because we scare people when we just say, oh, it's artificial intelligence and replacing jobs. I think we really need to get the message about intelligent augmentation where we are working together and trying to figure out what those next steps are.
So I have kids that have just graduated not too long ago myself, so I've been through some of this, and I tried to point them towards things like coding, and they went in the direction of stuff like culinary and TV and broadcast. But I think even within tech, and I didn't break out the jobs this way, but some of those occupations are middle skill jobs. And that skills mix I talked about, which is a blend of technical and soft skills, I think employers, especially adept, smart employers, are hiring more for skills. And so maybe someone lacks a little bit of the technical experience, but if they show the right set of soft skills, that can be very appealing. So that could be getting into some form of computer coding. That's where there's something like the boot camps, these kind of things that come in and plug gaps can be effective. And other things like computer user support positions are useful. And those other industries too, like electronic shopping, that's a huge industry. Retail is declining in the brick and mortar sense, but the e-side is growing rapidly. Companies like Amazon, we know companies like Alibaba coming into this country and starting to hire. So you really have to kind of look at the companies you want to go after, probably first and foremost, and then you can target a job search around that. But I think there are ample opportunities, and as we highlighted, the market right now is quite good. I mean, research from others for graduates this year points this to being one of the best years since like 2006, 2007. So the overall environment, it's competitive, but there's a lot of opportunity.
And just building off what Bruce said, I think we will start to shift more towards a skill-based, task-oriented work environment, and that supports this idea of an agile work environment. This has long existed in Hollywood, where they'll come together for a movie project based upon certain skill sets, and then after the movie project is done, they break apart, and so you have a much more robust environment around independent workers who bring to the table unique sets of skills. Those skills are employed for a certain project, and then they disband and go about their other tasks. And the economics there made sense years ago to keep them separate rather than bring them under one firm and have long periods of slack, essentially, in their roadmaps. And so I think what you'll start to see is more of that type of work develop in certain areas. And we're an incredibly creative country, and humans as individuals are incredibly creative. Gary brought up the role of self-driving cars. And I think things like that will change dynamics significantly. So yes, we may have, maybe we automate fast food restaurants quicker than other environments, and so there, there's concern around where do teens work. But I think the role of self-driving cars will open up entirely new opportunities. So for example, today we drive through the Walgreens or the Duane Reads or wherever to pick up our prescriptions. If we have self-driving cars, are we going to want to actually drive to pick something up, or are we just going to want to send a vehicle to pick it up for us? And if it does, how does that handoff take place? And how does it happen at the end of that, the proverbial last mile on that supply chain? And does a teenager come in and serve that and facilitate that role? So there's lots of things that I think will start to evolve over time. And we've seen these shifts slowly start to take place over time. I took my 3 sons months ago to the White House, and my youngest said to me after we left, Dad, I think I want to be president of the United States if my YouTube career doesn't take off. And that wasn't a career, that wasn't an occupation when I went to school. And now that's a viable occupation for some. And so we create these new opportunities. So thank you very much.
Thank you.